All right.
Speaking first for OG Sullivan Barth.
Oh, speaking second for OG Hajara Gado.
Speaking first for Charlotte Massey.
Speaking second for Quinn Boyle.
Speaking first for CG, Nate Aubert.
Speaking second for CG, Amanda Werner.
Speaking first for CEO, Justin Cooper, and there's no whip.
Sorry.
Alrighty. Prime Minister, here.
Is everyone good to go? Many people understand that climate change will be catastrophic. They understand that glaciers will be melting, disease vectors will be spreading, wildfires increasing, stronger storms. They know that all of this will happen, but it will happen somewhere. They don't understand and they don't conceptualize that it will happen to them. They don't understand that it will affect them in suburban America or wherever they live. They see it as an issue for elsewhere, one that doesn't affect them personally, and that is why we have seen minimal action on climate change and no progress. And what this will do, this will ultimately inspire people who need to take action by increasing their empathy, and will also do so in a time manner that is reasonable with taking the necessary action on climate change. So for a model, what we're going to say is we're not going to be going up to people and like creating this myth that climate change is man-made, because that's like scientific evidence right there. We don't need to exaggerate that. What we're going to be doing is we're going to be exaggerating the effects that climate change has on the individual and also exaggerating the individual's contributions towards climate change. So what this will be like, if you live in Oregon or something, saying, oh, wildfires will pose an incredible threat to your house, even if it only like pose like a somewhat marginal threat to your house, or saying these type of trees you really love will be like wiped northwards by climate change, when they necessarily like will not be drastically reduced in population. And then also like, oh, your carbon footprint is contributing this much to global warming, like inflating those statistics to make them feel like they have a bigger contribution towards climate change and need to take more action on it. So then the first main point here is we're going to make powerful people and populations care. Because one of the facts about climate change is that it has uneven distribution of its burdens. So the burdens of climate change often mostly fall on the developing areas and the ones who have less privilege. So this means that nations such as like the United States and Canada and Northern Europe will tend to fare better than the rest of the world about climate change. So they have less of an incentive to care, and their people have less of an incentive to care about it. And they're uniquely the ones that have the ability to take action and stop climate change. So what this will do is this will take these people, and by giving them these exaggerations about the effects of climate change, incentivize them to take action because they feel a personal connection to the negative effects and consequences of climate change. And by doing so, this will increase the empathy and the strength of the climate change movement within these countries and make it more likely that legislation will be passed and make it a higher priority within these countries to combat climate change because the residents feel like this will personally affect their day-to-day lives. And then the second point we're going into here is that the status quo hasn't brought about the necessary change quickly enough to combat climate change. And as we know, like the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change recently released a report conclusively showing that within 12 years, if we don't take enough action, there will be catastrophic, irreversible climate change above 2 degrees Celsius that will have a chain reaction of events that will just cause havoc on the environment. But we haven't taken the steps necessary to combat climate change. We have the scientific consensus that it's man-made since the 1970s. Back in 1992 at the UN Convention on Climate Change in Rio, the world nations came together and agreed that climate change was a problem. But since the world nations agreed climate change was a problem, our emissions have gone up. So while we have the scientific data available, having the data has done us nothing. We haven't taken the steps necessary to combat climate change, and it's shown that just because you know that there is a problem doesn't mean that you're solving the problem. Yes, I'll take your POI.
If data has done nothing in the past, how is it going to do anything in the future?
Because what we're doing is exaggerating the effects of that data to put a personal spin on it to make people care. People don't care that the glaciers are melting at 10% a year, but if you tell them that, oh, the glacier's melting at 10% a year is going to mean your house is going to go underwater when really your house will be fine by 3 feet worth of sea level rise. That's the difference. People can know that the glaciers are melting rapidly, and they can know that climate change is going to go 5 feet, but if they live, the oceans will rise 5 feet, but if they live 6 feet above the ocean, they don't give a damn. But if you tell them that it's going to go 10 feet, then they'll start to care, and they'll be worried, and they'll take action on it. Yes, I'll take your POI.
Okay, terrifying people into action doesn't seem like a very good way to get a practical solution for climate change problems. Oftentimes, if you sensationalize the solution as improper or even detrimental to the climate change cause or solving the problem.
Okay, I think climate change is something that people should be scared of, and people should feel the need to go take action on it. This isn't a minor issue. And I think that making some people in the developed world a little scared is worth it if it means saving the lives of millions of people in developing countries. And then going to this point, so what we're saying here is that if you take these steps, if you make people care about it, if you scare them a little, you'll jumpstart action on climate change. And we need this immediate action because, as we showed, the clock is ticking. You have 12 years or else it's irreversible and catastrophic. And then, ultimately, what we're saying is this is a gamble. Because, yes, as it mentioned, there is a very slim chance that it gets uncovered. But let's assume the worst-case scenario. Let's assume that they do uncover that we are exaggerating these statistics. Yes, we take the burden that it will probably lose us credibility and it will probably slow down action on climate change. But the thing is, if we don't exaggerate these statistics, we still lose. Because what's happening is, I think I've shown pretty conclusively that the availability of this scientific information has not taken us enough action in the time span we need to. So either we do nothing, as the opposition side wants us to do, in which case we have all this information but no one gives a shit about it, and we continue on our current track of inaction, or we take this risk and either get these people to care because they think it has a personal impact on their day-to-day lives, or they find out that there's some very, very slim chance that we're exaggerating it and we lose credibility. So yeah, we accept that it is a gamble, and we accept that there's a very small chance of losing. But it's either you don't take this gamble and you lose, or you take this gamble and you have a chance of actually taking action on climate change and reducing it before it gets to this 12-year benchmark of the IPCC. So ultimately, just reviewing what we said is that we're not going to just be completely making up complete falsehoods. We're going to be exaggerating the effects of it to entice people to take action on it. And what we're doing is we're personalizing the effects of climate change to these powerful people and populations in developed areas that have the ability to take action on it. And by personalizing it, you increase empathy, you increase its national importance, you increase legislation and action on it, and you do so in the time frame that's necessary in order to have an effect on climate change and prevent it from killing millions of people. So we're personalizing it, bringing it into people's day-to-day lives, and making it one of their highest priorities, and doing so is the only solution we have to combat this issue. And for these reasons, we are proud to propose.
The light's still on as well.
Intermission. Just 2 seconds.
I didn't punch.
We don't need scientists to exaggerate the certainty of climate change being caused by people because it's very likely that that is the case, right? We don't need scientists to exaggerate the impact that people in developed countries have when already research shows the average American expends about 30 times as much CO2 as the average Indian. We don't need to lie. What we need is to do a better job telling a story using the data that already exists, using data that is true and factual and isn't fabricated. We think we can solve most of the problems that Van tells you by doing a better job of training scientists to be storytellers or having the media tell stories using that data rather than just presenting cold hard facts. Lying about those cold hard facts is not going to solve the problems that Van talks about. Instead, it's going to make the scientific community liable to huge possible attacks that can put us back decades in our fight against climate change. 3 main arguments. First, will this information get out and what happens when it does? Second, how do we actually solve climate change? because we can do that in 7-minute speeches, obviously. And then third, why is this against the nature of scientific research itself, and why do we think that's important? So first, will this information get out? We think, yes, as an individual scientist making this decision, you think there's a low likelihood. We think it's quite likely that this information can and will end up getting out. Why is that the case? First, because of the way that scientific publishing works. When you contribute your scholarship, first, there are usually many people working on this together, which means it's not just you as an individual, but many people submitting a study because it takes many years to do research, especially climate research, which means that many people have to be in on it, and the more people that are, the more likely that it's going to get out somehow. But also because when you submit research to a journal or any kind of publication, it's going to be reviewed by your peers and by that journal itself, and they have an incentive to not publish things that they know are falsehoods, which means it's likely that they're going to find you out. But second, because people often repeat scientific studies in order to determine whether or not the research was correct, and if people redo the studies and realize that your results were way out there and were not true, it's likely that you're going to be found out for having lied, or at least your study won't be viewed as the truth in scientific research in the same way as it might have been. Second reason, because of political pressure. There are huge lobbies, funded primarily by the oil industry and other industries that are entirely against the debate of climate change being real, who put millions of dollars directly into trying to disprove these studies every time they come out. So we think it's likely you're going to have people whose full-time jobs are going through all of these studies, trying to pick holes in them and trying to find lies. There are tons of articles online that are just totally false, explaining why every study might have a flaw and explaining all of the conspiracies. People who don't believe in climate change already believe that scientists are lying. They don't trust scientific research. They don't trust that it happens behind closed doors, that they don't have full access to the information, and they distrust what these researchers are doing. There are tons of narratives about how they're scientists are trying to make money. This is a scam from China, all sorts of bullshit that's really difficult to disprove. And the way that science can disprove it now is by saying, no, this is true. We follow a clear procedure. If it comes out that there is any kind of falsehood within this, it's likely to massively discredit the movement. We think that is a much bigger harm than Van told you. I'll take closing now.
Sure. If that's already believed to be the case by the majority of the detractors, what is the unique harm that happens on our side of the house?
Yeah, okay, so I'm going to get to that next. Okay, so what happens when you're found out? First, we think there's a massive decrease in legitimacy, right? Because, yes, there are some people who already believe that climate change is real. They're going to believe this study no matter what, and they're going to continue believing it's real, even if the study is discredited, right? Because, they have seen the effects, they think that it's real, they're often politically liberal or have that bias already. Then there are the people who deny climate change exists, and they're probably going to continue denying it whether or not this study comes out, but they're likely to have more ammunition if they find out that this study truly was falsified. But then there are people on the fence who believe, yes, climate change is maybe true, I'm not really sure, I'm still waiting to hear a better narrative, I'm still waiting for more facts. We think that those people don't want climate change to be real, right? I would love it if climate change wasn't real and we are going to have huge impacts in the next 12 years. Humanity isn't going to suffer and die. I can continue living the same lifestyle that I'm living now. And there are many people who feel those same sentiments. So we think is that they're likely to latch onto this as an example of climate research not being accurate, or at least being exaggerated, which means that also people telling that they need to cut back on their lifestyles, people telling them that we need to do things that curb economic growth, potentially, in order to stop climate change, aren't necessarily true, which means it's harder to get policies passed, which means you're less likely to get the types of climate action that we think that we need. We think that it's going to be incredibly bad. And this narrative of scientists lying is something that we cannot abide by. So how do we think we actually get solutions on climate change, right? Because we think that's an incredibly important point within this debate. We think that within a democratic system, what you need for a large portion of the population to believe that this is not only something that's scientifically accurate, but also something that is important, which is why you're lying, right? You're lying because you want people to be more sure. We think that you lying and slightly exaggerating by saying that sea levels are going to rise 10 feet instead of 4 is first really difficult for people to conceptualize, in the same way that telling people that sea levels rising 4 feet was already difficult to conceptualize. You're not really making a big impact there. We think telling better stories with the data that's true is a better way to do that, which is something we can do on our side of the house without lying. But we also think for those people on the fence, this is something that can really majorly tip them over, and also create a national story that's just about this study being false and whether or not that's important, rather than focusing on what we really need to be talking about, which is how we can take tangible steps now, how we can cooperate with other governments, how we can create international push to limit our carbon emissions. We think that lots of politicians who have control in democratic systems are already like largely bought out or swayed by oil money and other groups like that. We think that it's going to be easier for them to continue that if they have a study they can point to that was falsified. Also, this happened in Seattle in the 1980s, and the scientific community is still reeling and still recovering from that because now climate deniers always point to that study, and scientists don't have a way to always prove that their research is true. You need to build this up over time in order to gain credibility. Why do we also think this is against like the nature of science, and why is that important? We think what science is like a constructed framework we've created in order to search for truth. We do experiments and tests in order to find more accurate information over time. It's never going to be perfect, but it's the best that we can do as humans. We think that we delegitimize that when you have any scientist lying about the results that they're creating. First, it makes it harder for future researchers to find the truth themselves because they're going to be basing their studies off of your research, but also it's more likely for people to distrust all of science, not just climate research. Like vaccine denial, like putting more money into scientific research. Why would we do that if we think scientists are going to lie or fabricate against their own political beliefs? We believe on opening opposition, it's incredibly important for science research to tell the truth. The truth is already bad enough. We can tell better narratives in order to convince people, but we shouldn't take the risk of lying and risk the movement in its entirety. Thank you, and quadruples.
If the truth is already bad now, and then we should use the data to actually show, people would have acted long time ago, as my first speaker already said. People did not act. People had conventions in Paris, in Rio, in Marrakesh, in Morocco, but they didn't have any, they are not taking any actions because they are not seeing that they are immediately being affected by this climate change, as my first speaker already said. The fact with storytelling and creating empathy, it might work, but it does not work as deeply as fear. It does not work as deeply as you might think, oh, tomorrow I might wake up and lose my home, I might lose my family. This will make people more reactive. This will make people more act about climate change. Making people being empathetic towards developing nations wouldn't make as much impact as actually bringing the thing closer to home and hitting actually where it hurts those people. Let me give you an example. For example, you have a homeless person going around. You know that person is going hungry. That person is actually having a difficult life. But many people wouldn't care. All of us, many of time, we pass towards those homeless people. We don't do anything. But then when we have this slightly doubt that that homeless person may be dangerous, that homeless person may come because he is homeless to actually attack you, you might react. You might actually find a way to actually find something to make that homeless person to neutralize it. That's the same thing with climate change. Fear acts more. Fear makes people act and reactive. It's deeper. It's more effective than actually being it's more effective than actual storytelling. But then I will go on our case about why we think that creating the exaggerating the effect on the individuals and the individual impact on climate change will have a bigger effect that we want to have. Time is tight, and we want to incentivize people to act right now in regards to climate change. As my first speaker said, in 12 years there will be irreversible, really dangerous impact on climate change that we wouldn't be able to come back to. That at that time we will be like, oh, we're messed up. This is fucked up. But what I wanted to say is, like, because time is tight and we only have 12 years, this is the last chance for scientists to make another impact, to see this is their last chance to actually make a desperate move, to make people act and react. And if people have this fear, they will react in the short run, and that's what we want. We want people to react in the short run in order to not cause this irreversible impact, because the only option we have now is just to wait and see what would happen. And people are not acting, and we need to act fast. But second of all, we want to incentivize people to have power, to make them care, to actually make them that it is actually getting closer to home, and they should care about this situation. When you talk, for example, a lot of us know about poor children dying of hunger in Africa, but we don't care much as when we see the person actually. We don't care much how we see the person actually closer to you. When we see an orphan closer to us and make him yes.
Yeah, why can't we solve this problem by having the media either spin these facts and lie rather than scientists? Or why can't we solve this problem by telling better narratives about the facts that are true rather than lying about the facts?
The fact is, scientists scientists are more credible. They have this credibility that the media doesn't have. People don't trust the media. The president called media the enemy of the people. Then the scientists are the only resource. Now we don't have time, and we have our only resource, which are the scientists, to be able to exaggerate these effects and to exaggerate this impact in order to make people more impactful. But then I will go on to rebut some of leader of opposition point. She talked about information to get out and how it wouldn't have. She talked about political pressure and oil companies, but oil companies have already won. What we are seeing now is oil companies, many people being skeptical about scientists. While they are making everything by the rules, they are playing by the rules, but there are still people being skeptical about climate change. There are still being people not believing climate change because oil companies have done such a good job making those people skeptical. And then each scientist steps, they can go back to each steps and pinpoint and make those people doubt the evidences. So I don't think it hurt as much. It doesn't hurt as much if scientists start fabricating facts to make people react. Because when you are fearful, you react quickly. You don't look much about the scientists, the evidence much as when you are not fearful, as we are right now. And they talk about how they want to make a bigger impact about storytelling. And as we already said, storytelling might work, but it doesn't work as much as we're talking about the fear here. But if they also talk about against the science nature for the science nature to be to fabricating factor, fabricating effect and impact. Yes, scientists have been well known to follow the rules, but now the thing now we don't have the option to follow the rules. And moreover, scientists have made a lot of mistakes. And I think we would want to take that chance of scientists saying fabricating effects and fabricating effects and individuals' impacts now and make people react so that we don't get into 2030 when we cannot go back and actually in 2030 science can say, oops, we made mistakes. Scientists made mistakes all the time. Scientists had flooded evidences, they had flooded things that goes, and then they came back to their mistake. They say, actually, we made a mistake. It doesn't make people less credible about scientists if they actually fabricated a fact because if they actually fabricated facts because they've been doing it for a long time. But let me give you some example about why because time is tight and our solution will work better than the side opposition solution. We have only 12 years as many scientists projects, which is true now, without any fabrication of facts. Yes?
Do you think that people will trust your data if they believe scientists have always been lying? Why would they trust yours over ours, and why is it that much better?
Scientists have made mistakes. So I haven't said scientists have already been lying. I say now scientists would be more likely to want to lie, and they may take that back in years when we'll have this impact, when we'll have people actually care about climate change. They might take this back as much as they took a lot of stuff back in scientific projects. But then people would care because when you come to someone and then say, oh, as my first speaker said, your house will be flooded or your house will be burned down if you don't act actually right now. Those people will act quickly and they will act before those 12 years hit us, which we are in a desperate move for this solution. But we would also have like a bit of power against oil companies that we are not having right now. Oil companies are lobbying politicians. They are lobbying politicians and they are making them say whatever they want, all these lies, and we don't have anything to counteract. We think that we need to have the same arms in order to battle those oil companies and bring more people on our side. And for all of these reasons, we're incredibly proud to propose.
Also, have we been doing names?
Oh, shit. Okay.
It's going. The green light is green.
Is that so long?
The light is green.
I'm gonna say my name.
Oh.
You're
Okay.
gonna say extra loud.
Mm-hmm.
So badly. Oh, where's my timer? Timer.
Since any of us can.
Okay. Oh
Fauci comes up here and they paint you this view of like climate science becoming this like sensationalist thing where they talk about how exactly every single like natural disaster is going to directly affect you as a result of climate science or as a result of climate change, and they're talking about how like wow, like science is gonna exaggerate and like really pull people and their heartstrings and like make them really want to, you know, be part of the climate change movement, how they want to take action, how they want to change policy. But then the member of government comes up here and talks about how like no one actually takes scientists seriously and how they get things wrong all the time, and like scientists have always been lying and always make mistakes. And so if you take that, if you take the idea that like scientists always get things wrong all the time and scientists always lie and always make mistakes, and like that's why it's okay to like fabricate here and there and exaggerate a little bit, with this like idea permeating and ubiquitous among society and among individuals that like science is always changing and science is sometimes wrong and disproved and discredited, why on earth would you take any of these like extra exaggerations on the certainty of climate change on your side of the house? We think that you should stick to the facts and you should leave it to the media to sensationalize. You should leave it to journalists to sensationalize. You should leave it to advocates and advocacy groups to sensationalize and to make people empathize with the problems of climate change. We think that exists on this side of the house, and you also get the legitimacy of facts and truth on your side and our side of the house. We think that you do not solve the problems of climate change. We think that you do not get people to act more, and we think that you ruin the one important thing about science is that it is founded in truth and trying to figure out how our realities work and trying to reach this like secure foundation for certainty that exists, and we think that is wrong to get rid of that. We think it is the role of the media to lie and fabricate and to exaggerate and pull at people's heartstrings. We do not think it is the role of scientists. Now into some rebuttal. So first thing that the member of government Noji talks about is like the power and the credibility of science and its impacts. First off, no one reads like scientific news articles. I mean, the general public doesn't. Maybe Van does in his environmental science course, or like for fun. I don't know what he does for fun. But like the general public doesn't actually like look up a specific scientific journal and can read and comprehend the scientific data of climate change and climate change science. The second thing is that if climate scientists start exaggerating on like the impacts of climate change and say like, oh, you know, the sea level is rising this much and like your home's gonna be flooded in 10 years and like, you know, your kid is gonna only live 30 years because like the air pollution is gonna be so bad that like the carbon dioxide is gonna ruin their respiratory tracts. Like if you really put all of that information and you like slam that information in someone's face, like they're kind of going to reject it, you know, they're going to retreat, they're not going to want to know the realities of the situation. That is why in the status quo, people reject climate change, because they don't want to believe that all these things are going to happen to them. They don't want to believe that like the problems are imminent and they're upon us. And so we think that, you know, the power and credibility of science that you discuss on your side of the house is just not the thing. Like, first off, I don't think that it has like incredible power among like the general public who consumes the media that gives like 3-minute sound bites and summaries of scientific news articles and scientific journals and can sensationalize and make people act. We think that is the role of the media and for individuals to take like the facts and to use them for however they want to use it. And now take your question.
So when people see a scientific statistic on the from the media, they ask what the source is. So people need a source for that statistic to trust the media, which means you need the scientists to provide that source and the evidence to the media for it to have any credibility. So don't you need our side of the house for you to have your advocacy groups and media going out and giving statistics?
No, I think that there are plenty of statistics in the status quo currently that show that climate change is happening, that is upon us. We think that like the fact that like mosquitoes are like populating like way more than they ever have before, and that malaria might come to the United States in the next 20 years is like a scientific fact that you can cite and that the media can use to make people scared and like empathize with the fact that, you know, our world is kind of dying and being destroyed. Okay, and so now I'd like to go into some constructive. So, alrighty. Exaggerating the data is important for making people care. But personalizing the effects of climate change is not on the burden of scientists, but it is the burden of citizens who want to improve this world. It is the burden of the media and the journalists, which we think exists on our side of the house. We think that the fact that you could ruin the relationship between science and the media by putting out exaggerated research is detrimental to the climate change community. Yes, when you are a media source, you do cite your sources, and you do cite the specific climate change fact. But once investigative journalists find out, when they actually look into these specific research and these specific cases and find that there are false or there are fabrications, then you no longer are going to use that source. You're no longer going to use that scientist. And you're going to call into question a lot of different sources, and it's going to make it a lot harder to convince people of the actual realities of climate change. We think that this detrimental effect outweighs any of the benefits that you get on your side of the house of like getting people to care more, because we think that in fact some of this will come out, as Charlotte showed to why this will come out, because of the way that scholarship is reviewed, because of the political incentive of specific companies like Exxon and Chevron and gas companies and oil companies that want to prove the falsities of this specific climate change research. But also, like, we think that the detrimental effects to scientists, like, who lose their job, to co-researchers, to families who, like, rely on, like, the scientists who, like, support their kids and stuff with their work, we think the detrimental effects outweighs any of the benefits that you get on your side. We think that the far right and people in power have the ability to use this to disregard climate change, especially the Republican Party in the U.S. And, like, even on your side of the house, if you say, like, oh, like, we do not take that it will convince more people just to have this research out there, because people live in their own echo chambers, number one. And we think that it will not incentivize any more action than, like, the media does through sensationalization. We think that just putting out more information, more data that is slightly fabricated will not actually incentivize action. We think that the role of empathy and the role of the media is actually the roles of the media, and ruining the relationship between journalists and scientists by putting out fabricated information is not the way to solve climate change. Alrighty, and because of all these reasons, this House does not support scientists who fabricate exaggerating the certainty of man-made climate change, where there's a low likelihood of being caught. And we think that low likelihood is actually not so low. Gosh, Joey kept calling me in the last 5 minutes of that game. I know, it's like Valentine's Day. He's probably like, where are you? He just FaceTimed me. Okay.
You seem to break it to have the debate is your true love.
I know.
Stop watching the mic for 52 minutes. My name is Nate. Hey. Hi. Okay, is everyone good? When the truth about climate change comes out, it gives certain actors a moral obligation to act on it and respond to the damages that both have already been caused and have been made inevitable or very, very likely by global climate change. Actors such as states, humanitarian institutions, corporations. We think it is the case that when the other party, that is to say those who have this scientific data but don't do nearly enough with it, do not hold up their end of the bargain in this moral obligation, what you are now morally obligated to do is force them into the level of moral obligation they actually have by upscaling the impacts, upscaling the perceived damages and threat of climate change to a level that leads to a form of action commensurate with what you believe was necessary in the first place, right? We think this debate is not just one that is focused in the developed world, and we think arguments about solely reducing emissions are beyond the pale of this debate. Not to say what happened in the first half was illegitimate, but rather that reducing emissions is illegitimate, but rather that we already know there are a ton of impacts of climate change where even if we cut off the entirety of our carbon emissions right now, we would see impacts that would persist for decades, in some cases centuries, and would do damage to huge parts of the world, especially the developing world, right? We see that the damage that is being done in the developing world is going to cause massive amounts of both loss of life, suffering, and is going to work as an impact magnifier for other humanitarian crises that occur there. As a result of that, we think that the form of data formulation we're talking about here is not, as Charlotte paints it, lying about how much the sea level is going to rise. It's going to be lying about the risk or potential body counts of things like man-made famines, droughts, resource wars that could be a proximate result of climate change. It's exaggerating the humanitarian crises where even if we reduce all of our emissions, even if we put every research dollar we have into finding every means of carbon sinking, we are still not able to avoid. Given this, we are going to present a humanitarian extension that specifically talks about how we specifically are able to incentivize these large-scale actors into better practice that is necessary to mitigate this massive amount of suffering. First, 3 points of independent rebuttal. One, they say that there exists this lack of trust in science, and that means our links are weak. This is a double bind. Either way, one, Either A, there's no trust in the scientific institution as it is, and all of their arguments are non-unique, which means you vote for the gov side on a marginal risk of our arguments being true, or B, what is much more likely is that there is already some trust in the scientific establishment, which means that the scientific establishment, not the media, is the ones who have the most proximate power to access these larger institutions. It means our links are significantly stronger. Secondly, they make this argument, this sort of an almost counter case about the media, where they argue that the media is able to resolve this. Two things. One, the media's sensationalism has at best a marginal effect on being able to incentivize the behavior of large-scale actors who are the ones who, one, have the most power to reduce emissions, and two, and much more importantly, have the ones who have the ability to engage in remissions for people who are already damaged by or inevitably will be damaged by climate change. But secondly, the media only focuses on sensational news in the first place. We agree with you here, which means you're only going to get airtime in the first place. You're only going to get your 3-minute soundbite if you are able to have an exaggerated crisis, if you are able to have something that is happening immediately. Not in 10 years this bad thing is going to happen, but rather there is an immediate conflict going on right now that necessitates actions, which means we control the internal link to the media, even talking about these sorts of things if they're going to frame it as a counter case. They're very cagey on this. I'll take one of you.
All right.
Okay, if you're fabricating evidence of something that's happening now, it's going to be very easy to tell that it's fake because it's literally happening. But also, why can't you just make predictions or use real evidence because it's likely that these things are going to happen?
Sure. This leads me to my third point, which is the credibility argument. You make the argument, first, not to be cagey on the model, but it specifically indicates that there is a low likelihood of being caught in most of these instances, right? The majority of people do not peruse peer-reviewed scientific journals for a living, and those who do probably are literate enough to know that climate change is real and happening, right? The worst-case scenario, like things like the legitimacy crisis in science and the fact that the news and media already publish already talk about contradictory studies all the time, means there's no abstract defense of scientific legitimacy here. There's no reason why empiricism has proven itself good in the long run. The fact of the matter is, things like the legitimacy crisis prove that instances of bad pedagogy, while they're bad for optics for the scientific community, don't suddenly cause everyone who believes in climate change to believe the entire scientific institution has gone wrong, because we're not fomenting a massive conspiracy, right? We'll bite that an individual scientists lose their job. We will not bite that this causes things like the EPA to suddenly be disbanded, or that might happen, but for entirely unrelated reasons. On constructive material, we are arguing here not simply that this is a debate about stories, but that we tell the better stories. We argue that there is a huge amount of limited capital in terms of political capital, people's attention, and actual intervention power in terms of things like food, aid, transportation, that people have to focus on humanitarian conflicts. We argue that flashpoints are almost always the focus of these conflicts, right? The news has no incentive to talk about famines that in truth, are absolutely inevitable and absolutely are going to happen. States have no incentive to act on these for optics reasons. They also have no incentive to act on them because they have no means of conceptualizing the impact that happens here. We're able to incentivize more immediate action in a few ways. One, we're able to exaggerate the material harms that will happen to the environment and to sources of capital, i.e. damages that will happen to resources or to worker populations. This is probably the only access to incentivizing, for example, corrupt regimes to engage in any action to help their people on climate change, or engaging corporations who are only incentivized by financials or optics as they relate to financials almost 100% of the time, which means when you present these as having a bigger capital cost or a larger time frame than they actually do, we actually solve significantly better here. This means that what we're essentially creating is fake flashpoints, which are good because, one, they allow us to solve for things like systemic violence that would never be addressed otherwise because the actual media would never drum them up as a flashpoint, even if they functionally are, and means we're able to solve for future flashpoints that are going to happen 20 years in the future, but need to be acted on as though they're occurring now. If you act in 20 years, it will be too late. If you don't act now, systemic damage is going to happen leading up to that, and then you get a flashpoint in the future, but by then it's far too late. We think these impacts prefigure anything they talk about. No, thank you. When the largest impact they have in this round is that there's a small risk of a chance to scientific legitimacy, we're going to bite that and say that that is immediately and massively preferable to a world in which there's no action taken at all, and a significantly, protected time, larger risk of preventing massive amounts of suffering and violence by large-scale institutions who actually have the capital to engage with it is significantly better. All right? I don't care if a handful of scientists lose their job. At the end of the day, climate change is the most proximate impact in this round because, one, life prefigures value to life, and you're only able to resolve other crises if people are alive and not suffering to deal with them. And more importantly, and two, and I think most importantly, it's an impact magnifier for nearly every other humanitarian crisis, which means that now future famines, future droughts, future resource wars are going to be, one, more common, two, significantly larger in magnitude. If states do not address climate change, they will not have the tools to address these now or in the future, or will not have any of the tools necessary to affect the magnitude of the suffering, which proves, one, that this is the most powerful proximate impact, two, that the way this acts as an impact magnifier means we have a moral obligation to engage in it, at the expense of perhaps other humanitarian crises that usually take up airspace, and finally proves that we alone present a moral obligation with the means to actually incentivize these actors to do anything, which is the only way to solve for violence and suffering for millions and billions of people, both now and in the foreseeable future. Proud to propose.
I'm Justin.
Hi, Justin.
Honorable panel, I'd like to begin my speech by first going into some extraneous rebuttal of the government side of the bench, and then afterwards I'll go into two constructive pieces of material. First, the extension on the importance of the loss of academic integrity, and secondly, on the alternative methods and work that scientists could be spending their time on. So first, to get into some points of extraneous rebuttal. In closing government, the main crux of their case depends on their extension of incentivizing these large-scale actors to be able to act by exaggerating these famines and wars over resources and these extreme events. First off, in the motion, it states scientists fabricated evidence exaggerating the certainty of man-made climate change. It's not about the effects; it's about the certainty that climate change is man-made, right? That it's not going to be, that it's not just how we're leaving another ice age, which many climate change deniers believe. It's not necessarily the fact that that they're talking about that these effects wouldn't happen. They're not saying that climate change is real, but these effects aren't happening. They're outrightly denying climate change, right? The debate is coming down to the fact about if these scientists should be able to not at this moment, about whether or not these scientists should be able to fabricate evidence to be able to convince people that climate change is real, right? That's the point of fabricating this evidence. And the government side kind of poorly models it by focusing it on exaggerating events that happen with climate change, because that already takes into account that that climate change, that they're not exaggerating the certainty, which is what the motion is about. And as our opening half did a lot of legwork on, there's a lot of evidence about how for years there's been evidence coming out from reputable scientific academic resources and reports stating about the impact of climate change. Not too many years ago, under the Obama presidency, when the Paris Climate Agreement, and there was talk about the 2 degrees Celsius warning, and if we reach over that, the detrimental effects that will occur on in society and on the world. So that also eliminates that whole point about how we're going to make it even more extreme, because frankly, there's been already a lot of reports and evidence out there talking about the extreme effects of climate change, right? And so that kind of causes that whole point to kind of go mute. So now to get into more of the constructive material that we're bringing to the table here. So first, that there's a loss of academic integrity when scientists are going to fabricate this evidence, right? I understand, and the closing bench understands the fact that that the motion did say that there's a low likelihood to be caught, but there is still a likelihood, right? And you have to account for that risk with any with any chance of this being found out, right? What are the effects that you can see from this? Well, one, there's going to be kind of a loss, an even greater, there are climate change deniers right now, right? But it's been established, in fact, in our society that climate change is real and that the deniers are kind of in the wrong, right? And so if you reveal that all this reputable evidence that society has been building on and basing itself off of, that some of it is believed to be false, actually does give less credit to what the popular belief is and what the right belief is and what we need to do. Secondly, this sets a very dangerous precedent for other academic sources, not just in terms of climate change and that crucial issue, but in other contentious political issues as well, where it's the precedent set that, this academic source lied about this important issue. And it's like, well, okay, with another issue, like maybe there's another institute or that's studying the effects of illegal immigration, or in the U.S., for example, and they decide to fabricate evidence, right? They say, oh, that's okay now because this other institute has done it. It's more acceptable. An allusion to this you can see is through the media, right? You look back in the 1970s, and like the New York Times and the Washington Post, they would fact check all and report on all stories and any information they had got before releasing it. Now that there are other sources that are based in like just on the internet, like Vice News and BuzzFeed, that release reports without actually verifying the facts. Sources like the New York Times are forced to release it, and they still kind of dodge around it by saying like, if this fact is true, then this would be the result. But they release it before it's actually verified, and they have to retract it. That's the effect that's happened when a source becomes less reputable, and as a result, all news sources are detracted from. Same thing happens with academic sources and academic studies, right? If one sets off the chain and the rest decide to follow it because they need to get their studies out there to show the effects and to get more support for try to get more support for their issue, or gain more support for and attention to their institute and themselves. That's going to happen more likely, and you see a negative effect where there's a whole lot of fabricated evidence out there on different subjects. Not to mention the fact that the whole point of science is and scientific research is to take a hypothesis and test it and report on it whether or not you like the results or not, right? That's the whole point of science. And you lose a whole lot of academic integrity by fabricating results. And the effect of that is that the whole kind of field of science is detracted from as a whole. Secondly, the second point of constructive is that scientists should can spend their time better on other areas, right? So we recognize that these scientists, they're fabricating evidence, right, and exaggerating it to the certainty of man-made climate change, and that takes time. That takes time to fabricate to set up the whole experiment, and then fabricate it to get information right. Scientists could better spend their time by finding different ways that could actually help to solve the issue of climate change, working on alternative fuel sources, working on different ideas that could better use resources, other ways that you can make renewable resources easier to use, right? And the effect from this is that you actually have real positive change towards something that could be done to actually solve the issue, rather than just trying to convince those deniers that are stuck in their ways, and when they see that it's snowing outside, say, look, climate change isn't real. And that's honestly not the best way to spend your time, because those people aren't going to change their mind anyway. The whole government bench focuses their argument on the ends justify the means here. But the fact is that the ends are pretty like non-existent. There's not a real lot of change on their side of the house, but on our side of the house, you actually have more positive stuff coming from scientists and less detraction from academic sources. Thank you, and we're proud to oppose.
Yeah.
Just next up.
I'm proud of my little dogs.
There's no other.
You're on video.
No other novices are debating in the round.
Oh,
Yeah.
I thought you were just going to exclude Pedro.
No, Pedro is right there. We cherish
Hi,
him
Pedro.
dearly, but he's not.
What are you guys recording for?
This is our trial round.
Like,
Our friends, Brian, Devon, and
Eva Marie.
Eva Maria. I forgot.
Remember that. Gotta respect the institution.
I understand.
Honorable panel, there are two key points of clash in this debate. The first one is, what is the best way to act to combat climate change? The second being, which side actually fulfills their moral obligation of acting on the truth? But before I go into both of these points, I'm going to address what we heard from closing opposition. So first, Justin wants to quibble a little bit on the model about the model of this debate, saying this debate is about the certainty of man-made climate change. But what we're telling you is, like, this debate is not about whether or not man-made climate change is real. In both worlds, it's the debate here is about like the effects that come from that. It's about the certainty of the crisis that occurs because of it. It's about like because when the scientific community is fabricates this evidence and says like that the certainty of what's happening here, like this huge famine is going to happen, the sea levels are going to rise incredibly. That's the type of thing that actually gets the community moving, right? And so the debate is not about like, oh yes, man-made climate change is definitely real. No, the debate is about it's real and this is what's going to happen and this is why we need to act. Like we think that they access a very shallow part of this debate and that side government actually accesses like more meaningful impacts. Okay, so moving on into their two-part constructive. So first they say that they want to talk about the loss of academic integrity and why that's important. But they first of all, Judge, I want to point out to you that the whole entire op bench has been operating in like the low probability world, right? Because we already tell you in the motion that it's a low likelihood to be caught, but all of that op wants to talk about is what happens if they are caught, but we already told you it's a low likelihood that it's going to happen. So we're operating in the we're operating in the more probable part of this debate, whereas they're operating in a very low probability. But we tell you that even if it doesn't happen, Nate told you that we don't care. Honestly, we'll bite the bullet if a few scientists lose their jobs versus an entire island nation going underwater because we didn't do anything to stop climate change. We actually prefer saving human lives over saving the jobs of a few scientists. Okay, no thank you. So, and also they want to talk about like going toward like having a slippery slope effect and going towards other disciplines. But again, we tell you that's a small harm compared to the drastic effects that we can actually attempt to solve on our side of the house, whereas in the status quo, you're just going to kind of be stuck like we currently are. Whereas we tell you that at least on our side, you get, even if you don't get a ton of action, at least you get marginal action. You're actually doing something to try and address and solve climate change. And then Justin wants to tell us about alternative methods that scientists can take. And we tell you, we provide the link to that, right? Nate brought to you uniquely from our extension that we are prioritizing climate change as the humanitarian crisis. And by doing so, big, powerful groups such as like the state and humanitarian institutions are funneling their time and funneling their money into combating climate change. And by doing so, scientists are able to pursue these alternative methods that Justin wants to pursue because they have more money and time to do so, because they're being funded by these institutions to do so. So we actually access that on our side of the house precisely because we're prioritizing climate change as the humanitarian crisis to address. Okay, but before moving on, I'll take opening. So you lose your job, as do all of your coworkers who worked on the study. Your lab loses funding from the government, so there's less research on climate change overall. And oil lobbies in the far right use this as leverage in order to stop environmental policies being passed that you want. We prove why it's likely that this is going to get out. Please engage. Okay, thank you. Yeah, so we already explained to you that due to the motion, you're operating in a very low probability world. That's a low likelihood of getting caught in the first place, so I feel like I don't really have to engage with that situation, especially when we have the more probable scenario on our side of the house. And even if that does happen, we already told you that the harms are so minute compared to an entire island nation going underwater that we don't think it really matters. Okay, so moving on to the first question or the first point of clash, which is what is the best who takes the best action to actually combat climate change? And the answer to this question is closing government, because we uniquely told you, first of all, how this action is going to occur by prioritizing climate change as the humanitarian crisis to solve. Nate explained to you how the time and money goes into play and how these states and nation states and humanitarian institutions are going to react when you actually exaggerate the material harms of climate change. And so you get that unique mechanism out of closing government. And we also, as closing government, we give you more powerful actors rather than OG which correctly wants to have individuals act. We think that's great. As closing government, we get you more powerful actors because we get you the nation states. We get you humanitarian institutions that can cross state lines and make meaningful international change. So we give you the more powerful actors in this scenario in order to combat climate change, whereas in the status quo, under both OO and CO, there's not really much going on because what they're arguing for is basically the non-action that's currently occurring, and the non-action is precisely because people don't think that climate change is going to have these drastic effects that it's actually going to have. So we need these scientists to do so, to exaggerate that evidence, which leads me into the second point of this debate that we don't think was really addressed by either op bench, which is why the scientists have a moral obligation to act on the truth, right? So scientists know that climate change, or that man-made climate change, is certain and that it's going to have drastic effects. And they have a responsibility, as Nate told you, because states and humanitarian institutions are not acting. They have a moral obligation to make sure that these states and humanitarian institutions act on behalf of the rest of the world and actually solve this issue. So we tell you that fabricating the evidence is okay because we get the response that we need. We get international action. We get powerful people involved. We're prioritizing climate change as a humanitarian crisis. And the reason why this is good is because by prioritizing climate change as a humanitarian crisis, you're actually able to address all other types of humanitarian crises because a lot of them come from climate change. Climate change is one of the systemic causes of all the other humanitarian crises that are occurring. So if you hit the root, if you actually funnel all of your money, all of your power, all of your time into the one humanitarian crisis that's actually causing the rest of them, that's more powerful. You access the most powerful impact from closing government specifically. So I already kind of told you why CG takes it over the entire op bench, which is because, first of all, they're based out of a low probability world, whereas we actually engage with the most probable scenario, and we told you why, even if the low probability happens, why it's not as much harm as you would get if you had no action at all. And then the reason why we take it over OG is because we access the more powerful actors for you. We actually get you the international action that's required to combat climate change rather than just individual people. We get both. We get individuals and we get the powerful actors. It's for these reasons that we so strongly propose. Thank you.
All right.
And there's no off limit.
All right. End of debate.
All right.
There's a
Who
little bit.
wants to stop that?
I can't because it's locked. So you have to do it.
All right.
Sorry.
Will you send this to everyone too?
Yes.
It's a ton to work with.